Assalamu alaikum, hello and welcome to the Voice of Islam Living History program. My name is Dr. Mohammed Iqbal. I'm your host for today's program. In these programs, we are looking at some of the ideas and personalities who have changed the world for us for the better. And in this program, we're going to look at a very, very special person. I'm not going to give it away who it is, but this person is rare in that religious books and history books talk about him. This is a great emperor, and his name was Cyrus the Great. He was adored by the Persians as he ruled the Persian Empire. He was respected by his adversaries, the Greeks, and he was praised by the Israelites who were freed by him. And he is honored by the Holy Quran also as a just ruler, referred to as Zulqarnain. We will talk about this later on. To discuss this great person, I'm joined by my expert panel, Amjad Hussain. Welcome, Amjad.
Thank you.
And Arif Ahmad again.
Thank you, Doctor.
And just to really say that a lot of the people that we talk about are great religious personalities, but this person was quite unique in being a ruler and mentioned in the holy books as well. Before we go on about Cyrus himself, let's talk a little bit about the environment in which he grew and some of the terminology, because a lot of people hear about the Persian Empire, etc., and they may not know that we are clearly talking about Iran. These terms are interchangeable, aren't they, in terms of Iran and Persia? So perhaps you could shed some light in how the two names came about and which one is older and how do we relate to them?
Well, actually, in 1935, then the king, the Persian ruler, was Reza Shah Pahlavi, and to appease the Germans, he said, well, there was obviously, if you can remember, the Germans were dominating Europe, and the Nazism was on the rise, and so basically to appease them, he called his land the land of the Aryan, i.e. Iran. And there was also southern Persia. They were already known as a place called Pars.
Because Persian is more a Western-derived name, isn't it? And there was a small region which we currently was Fars or Persis, as it was known in the ancient
Persis,
times.
Persepolis,
yeah.
Fars and Pars. That is the geographical area, is on borders southern Iran.
And it's interesting. I have to say, until recent times, didn't realize Iran's link with the Aryan land of the Aryans, and clearly with the Indo.
The name Iran actually means land of the Aryans, so it's obviously this connection with the Aryan race.
So these were the people who came from the Eurasian continent, the steppes.
From the first and the second millennium BC to early first millennium BC. The Aryans that originated from the steppe, Eurasian steppe, they basically migrated into India and then also southwards from Bactria, which is basically Tajikistan, Afghanistan, present-day Afghanistan. It was known as Media then, and then into southern Iran, which is southern Persia, or the Fars, and they settled there. So basically, the people that inhabited this region, the Medes, the Persians, the Bactrians, and the Parthians on the Iranian plateau.
So in terms of Iran then, the two major tribes that coexisted were the Medes and the Persians, and the Medes were the more dominant, weren't they?
Absolutely. The Median king at that time, who was also the grandfather of Cyrus the Great, he married his daughter to the Cambyses the First, who was the father of Cyrus the Great.
There's an interesting legend behind this, and before you go into how Cyrus was born, take us through this legend, because I like everything else. Who knows how much is mythology and how much is truth, but the grandfather of Cyrus, he had a dream or something, didn't he?
Oh, absolutely. The legend goes that King Astyages, the king of Medes, he was the overlord of the Persians, and he gave his daughter in marriage to this vassal king, Prince Cambyses. And from this marriage, Cyrus was born. And Astyages, having had a dream that the baby would grow up and overthrow him, ordered Cyrus to be slain. But his chief advisor, who was a Magi and a holy man, he begged mercy, and he said, well, the baby could be given to a shepherd family to be raised. And then when obviously a 10-year-old Cyrus grew up, and he had outstanding abilities and qualities, and it was discovered by Astyages that he was still alive in spite of his dream. But then I think he was persuaded to allow this boy to live, so the legend says. And his dream was that his daughter was being drowned by a flood of wine, and so forth. And it was interpreted that his offspring will grow and he will swamp all of Asia. And subsequently became true. He became the first emperor.
Absolutely, and
yes.
we're going to deal. But it's interesting how legends develop, and how many legends had this. A baby was meant to be killed, but they survived and they became. Arif, that's about the legend, but the emperor and Cyrus the Great, his appearance was around. I mean, I know people vary, but 580,
590 BC.
Before the Christian era, yeah.
Before this is a sort of the historical consensus on when he was born. He had different titles. Cyrus the Great, also known as Cyrus II. There's also some conjecture about the meaning of his name, but generally taken to meaning like the sun. So obviously a significant meaning in terms of his name. And around the time when he was born, these two tribes, which we'd previously mentioned, the Medes and the Persians, obviously they were not united, and he was able to sort of, in effect, bring them together and to bring them under the first Achaemenid emperor, the first Persian Empire. That was the beginnings of what we would commonly be called the Persian Empire. So when he brought these two together, then his other next task, he was like all military rulers, always looking, having achieved one objective, looking to achieve another objective. So once he brought these together and formed the Persian Empire, he was looking to bring in the other neighboring empires, the Lydian and the Babylonian empires.
I mean, at that stage, it was the biggest land empire that anyone had seen. Clearly, there had been other empires from early Sumer and Babylonia, etc., Assyria, but this was one of the biggest ones.
All the way from the Middle East to the Indus River, to the Mediterranean Sea. So quite a vast landmass.
Incredible achievement.
Yeah.
But before we go into the details then of his empire and his achievements, whatever, I just wanted to know, how do we know about Cyrus? Because this was such a long time ago. So what's our records that we used?
Well, the important sources for biography of his life is the Greek historian Herodotus, and there is idealized biography by another historian called Xenophon, and Strabo, another Greek historian, mentions him as well. And so we get all this, obviously, well-preserved history that, but we must, there's a caveat here, and that is that, so subsequently we know what Alexander did to the Persian Empire. Yes, so we must take all this with a pinch of salt, because, they had a lot of innuendos and, political scores to settle with the Persians. So basically, and we know now there is that famous battle of Thermopylae, that 300, and there's a film on it as well, which is ridiculous.
Plays everything.
So it's we know that there is a lot of xenophobia, a lot of but nevertheless there is undercurrents of history that there is there, and then I think Arif also did mention, and I think you have as well, that is also talked about in the Bible, the Torah.
That's right, yeah.
And in the Holy Quran.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing is that there are multiple mentions or large parts of the Bible and the Holy Quran, not just in one place, where he's mentioned both in a historical concept and in a spiritual concept. And I suppose it's good to corroborate that with the history, because that way then you can say, well, there's a historical account and there's also an account in a religious book. So, of course, with any history, by piecing this information together, you get to get a fuller picture of the individual.
And there is, of course, Persians have their own history. They are, a civilization, existing civilization, a surviving civilization. And there is the Book of the Kings they have, Shahnameh. And it's quite thoroughly detailed, Persian history there.
I mean, you mentioned obviously the accounts we know from the Greeks, and one has to say, despite their enmity in relation to Cyrus, it's interesting. Most historians would say that the Greeks showed deep respect. They didn't show it to any of the other Persian rulers that came afterwards, but certainly for Cyrus. Arif, just if I can turn to you then. So Amjad mentioned, obviously, and I think you did earlier on as well, he unified the
Medes
and the Persians.
Yeah. Well, they were originally connected in both origins and language. And obviously Cyrus saw this as an opportunity to basically bring them together and consolidate his hold on power. Because I think it's worth remembering that at the time when he became king, he wasn't really an independent ruler. And like most kings, obviously they want to seize power and they have to look at where they're going to start. So this is
why his maternal grandfather allowed him to live, because he was really a vassal king after his father had passed away. So he had him under his thumb.
A subordinate king, so obviously had some degree of power, but obviously still was reporting to or still under a superior king. And that's why he was permitted, in effect, to be a king.
But his dream came true, though. He turned the cards.
Absolutely. So obviously, as a young man, incredibly ambitious. And after bringing the Medes and the Persians together, he turned his attention towards the Lydian Empire in Asia Minor. And the ruler of that at the time was King Croesus, who was an incredibly rich man. And Sardis was the Lydian capital at that time. Now, there was obviously a lot of planning and wars and battles, but in about 546 or 547 BC, Croesus was taken prisoner by Cyrus, and these empires, or these became part of the Persian Empire. Also, the Greek cities on the Aegean coast and the vassals of the Lydian king, they also became subjects. So in effect, the vassals that were previously under King Croesus, they became now vassals of Cyrus. And I suppose we should just explain, a vassal has some sort of meaning in a feudal system, in that the person has some autonomy, but is ultimately responsible for the king, which in this case was Cyrus.
So it's interesting, because when in the second part of this program, we were going to look at the Holy Quran and biblical sources as well in relation to Cyrus the Great. So having conquered the sort of northwestern side, he turned eastward towards the sort of Indian side and the Persian side. And he went as far as the Indus River, the River Jhelum, a lot of the Central Asian republics as well. But having consolidated his rule there, he turned to the biggest prize, I suppose, and that was the Babylonian Empire. Amjad, do you want to take us through that a little? Because really, for so much of mankind's history, the Babylonian Empire has featured so prominently.
By the year approximately 940 BC, so the chronicles tell us, is that Cyrus succeeded in capturing Elam, which is called Susa, was a prominent, and subsequently became his second capital as well. Susa was, Susa still figures prominently in subsequent Persian empires as well. Then Cyrus fought a battle near the modern river Tigris, a place called Opis, and there he routed the Babylonian army, and then he basically managed to secure another city, which was a capital called Sippar, which was seized without a battle and with hardly any resistance from the populace, and it was also because they surrendered without a battle was because he was known as a peacemaker, he was known as a legendary military commander and a just ruler, and also the fact that the Babylonians were sick and tired of their own king, who was the son of the famous Nebuchadnezzar, and he was a decadent king, very abusive and evil king. So the population were already in turmoil against their own. Babylonia was ripe for takeover. So it's basically all these conditions helped Cyrus the Great conquer Babylonia. And also there is that famous legend in the Bible of the dream of Prophet Daniel, the famous writing on the wall. So he was able to capture Babylonia and subsequently free the Jews.
Yeah, I was
who
just
were,
going to ask.
resettled back into Palestine, but obviously the 12 tribes didn't all. Some of them were settled in the Persian Empire.
I mean,
and Arif will allude more to it.
Yeah, out of all the people, the Jewish, the Israelites really welcomed Cyrus with open arms. So take us through a little bit, and he's given a lot of reverence,
Absolutely.
isn't he?
I mean, one thing which I wasn't aware of was that Cyrus is the only non-Jewish person in the Bible to be called the Anointed One, and obviously there has to be a good reason to that. Amjad was mentioning how much in high regard he was held, mainly because of his diplomacy and also supporting local customs. But even in the Bible, this is in the book of Ezra, verse 1 to verse 4, there's a sort of a proclamation about Cyrus, famous for freeing the Jewish captives in Babylonia, and varying reports, but at least up to 30,000.
I mean, the Bible's full of stories of how they were taken into captivity, into Babylon, into bondage, and mistreated, and all the prayers and crying and sacrifices, and now here comes a great
leader, and he allowed them to return to their homeland. So this was just one aspect of how he basically helped consolidate power by being merciful and by also being just in as much as a military leader can be.
There is another part to this in terms of his really affiliation and closeness to the Jewish monotheistic faiths and the captivity of the Jews. But he, having freed the Jews, he turned to one of the most troublesome areas, and that was the sort of northern nomadic tribes around the Caspian and the Black Sea. And I think ultimately it was around the sort of Central Asian areas where he finally died as well. But those nomadic tribes were well known for attacking Asia regularly.
Yeah, that's actually what is mentioned in the Holy Quran as well, and we'll talk about it in the second program. And so he basically came upon a group of people with a set sun between the two peaks, and they could hardly understand his language, and they alluded to the fact that they were regularly attacked by these nomadic, vicious people from the north, and if he could help build a barrier between them and these people. And
that's a fascinating story, which we'll talk. So having looked at his conquests, and as I say, by all accounts, that was one of the biggest empires. Let's look at the man himself and his achievements. Now, as I say, the dates that are given for Cyrus are roughly 580 to 529 or so BC. Some historical records say that he may have been a close contemporary of Zoroaster, the prophet that was so well known and established in. But then other sources say Zoroaster could have been anywhere between 500 BC to 1500. So we really don't know, but clearly he was follower of the monotheistic faith that, do you want to shed some light?
It looks like that definitely Zoroastrianism had some impact on his personal way of thinking. It's clear that he believed in life after death, the mercy that he showed, the treatment towards religious minorities. These are all teachings or philosophies followed by Zoroaster. So it looks like, even if the timeline didn't quite match, that there was definitely some impact on him as a person from following that.
I mean, some of the basics, Amjad, in relation to Zoroaster, they were very staunch monotheistic people, as I understand it. This belief in heaven and hell and good and evil, the battle between the two, sort of the wisdom of the Lord obviously being a central figure. I can't recall exactly what term they used.
Well, actually, if you look at it, the pure Persian Zoroastrian religion was monotheistic in its approach. Had similarities, more or less similar strands, if we can, because there are semantics and words which are obviously dissimilar, but they tie up with the current, Judo-Christian and Islamic thinking as we have it. They believed in a prophet, they believed in a deity, they believed in good and evil, heaven and hell, and so forth, and good and evil and righteousness, and universal values that we, basically the people of the Middle East could adhere to. And the main aspect was monotheism, I think, which is basically Abrahamic faith. And so we have those similar strands, because remember, Abraham came from the city of Ur, was himself a Chaldean, and that lived in Babylonia. So here there was a group of people that, obviously monotheism was not just unique to Abrahamic faith, but other communities too as well. And hence we find later on that most of the ethics and principles that he adheres to, once you subdue a group of people, there was no need for you to burn the people, livestock, land, and so forth. So he exercised mercy, compassion, and benevolence, and he was the first ruler who actually ruled over multiple faiths. Obviously his community and his empire consisted of multiple nationalities, so he was the first multinational empire, and he exercised not just tolerance, he set up universal codes, each community to themselves, and they were allowed, there was religious freedom, freedom of thought, freedom of conscience. So he was basically epitome of all, and hence he's influenced most of our modern thinking as well. And the father founders of the United States, for instance, Thomas Jefferson, and I think there is his effigy somewhere in Capitol Hill, I've been informed. And there are statues of him in Sydney, Olympic Park in Sydney. There is a bust of him in somewhere in Germany. So Cyrus the Great has occupied.
I mean, the Iranians would say he was the author of the first human rights article.
Well, there's an interesting relic, the Cyrus cylinder, which is become to known, and this is directly traced to the time of Cyrus the Great, and it's basically a clay cylinder. Now it's in pieces, but it has been deciphered, and people would say that would be almost in effect the first declaration of human rights. Now, the Shah of Iran, he's very proud about this. He's called it the first human rights charter in history. And it basically had a code of conduct, or a way of sort of stating what rights and rules and obligations people had. And I suppose the best way of describing this is in 2003, the Nobel laureate who accepted the Nobel Peace Prize, Shirin Ebadi, and she quoted Cyrus, and she said, "I am an Iranian, a descendant of Cyrus the Great. This emperor proclaimed at the pinnacle of power 2,500 years ago that he would not reign over people if they did not wish it. He promised not to force any person to change his religion and faith, and guaranteed freedom of all. The Charter of Cyrus the Great should be studied in the history of human rights." Now, these days we take these sorts of things for granted, but 2,500 years ago, this was a very, very new alien concept. And whether that was just that he was very intelligent, very savvy, and realized that to rule over this super state, you had to have something set down that people could follow and people could hold you account to, or whether he was just like that as a person, probably a little bit of both. And that's why he was able to, keep this empire together for such a long time.
I mean, one of his skill was really allowing that freedom of faith and respecting other cultures as well, but also the way he appointed his key figures, Amjad, because even with the first takeover, when he basically took over the Median Empire from his maternal grandfather after defeating him, he appointed a lot of Medes to the key prominent posts as well, merged the two tribes together
He was the first emperor who promoted people because of their skills and abilities rather than their nobility and background. Although obviously he needed to make alliances with nobility and the ruling elites, but actually he gave prominence to talent. So he basically created meritocracy, as it were. And not just that, there are many other innovations that are introduced in building projects. He was and technologies. So he bonded his new empire to keep his empire together. The first actually extensive road building throughout Asia. All the way from modern Anatolia, Turkey, from the Bosporus, all the way to the Indus Valley. And there was a postal system. And I think they say that every modern mile or mile and a half, there were horses placed strategically. So basically, the mail system, the courier can ride for a mile or 10 mile or 50 mile, and you'll find fresh horses, water, food, and there was kind of a garrison as well. And I think the Greeks copied most of his tactics as well, the centurion and so on, the legions. So basically, he was legendary, not just legendary military commander, but also monumental builder. And to mention, he actually made the first garden called Paradise. Hence the word paradise comes into modern linguistics. And he collected every single fruit through his dominions. And every single plant. So first botanical gardens, long before the Kew Gardens in London, were in Persia. And all the roses. I think one book I was reading, he collected over 4,000, just kind of phantom, 4,000, variety of tulips and roses. That's absolutely, fascinating.
And it sounds very, very simple, a postal system. Why? These soldiers, obviously, they were away from their families for long periods of time. And this postal system helped them stay in contact with their families. Families would be sending them letters, parcels. So it was also about keeping, the soldiers happy as well, so that they would be prepared to fight for him.
So really, the empire that Sir Cyrus founded, as I said, was the biggest known at that time. The main features were that he quickly vanquished his enemies to the west and went up to the Aegean Sea and up to parts of Macedonia and the Greek lands. To the east, he went up to the Indus River and Jhelum and Central Asian republics as well. And the most difficult parts were the northern nomadic tribes, the Scythians and a variety of others that we're going to cover in the second part of this program. And much of this is related to the prophecies and the dreams that the various prophets had, and also the Holy Quran deals with. So we will come back to that in the second part. Assalamu alaikum. So welcome to the Living History Program, Part 2. We were talking in the first part, Amjad and Arif, about Cyrus the Great and his achievements that we know of from a variety of records, especially the Greek records. In this part, I would like us to explore more deeply the relationship the Jewish faith has with Cyrus the Great, and also Islam through the Holy Quran as well. And there are lots of different chapters and books in the Bible, Arif, aren't they, in relation to what was said about Cyrus the Great. But I think one of them was the prophecy by Prophet Daniel, Amjad. Can you just read to us what that prophecy is in relation to Cyrus?
Well, in the Testament, there is the Daniel's vision of a ram and a goat, and it's in Daniel 8. Mm-hmm. And it says, in the year of King Belshazzar reign, I, Daniel, had a vision. After the one I already appeared to me. In my vision, I saw myself in the citadel of Susa in the province of Elam. In the vision, I was beside the Ulan Canal, and I looked up, and there before me was a ram with 2 horns standing beside the canal, and the horns were long. One of the horns was longer than the other, but grew up later. I watched the ram as it charged towards the west, and the north, and the south. No animal could stand against it, and none could rescue from its power. It did as it pleased, and became great.
Now, it's interesting, these 2 horns are also referred to in the Holy Quran as Zulqarnain in relation to this great conqueror and what he did. So Prophet Daniel clearly is talking about a great conqueror, emperor who's going to, and the interpretation by most scholars are that this was in relation to Cyrus, because he was standing in Persia, as he says, in that city. And it's in relation to that. Amjad, do you want to say a bit more on that?
Sure. As Prophet Daniel is alluded to is in dream, and the interpretation is that Prophet Daniel himself is standing in the citadel of Susa. Susa was one of the capitals of Persian Empire, the Southern Empire, in the province of Elam. And this is exactly where the Achaemenian Empire, Achaemenes comes from, and the Achaemenides Empire comes from, and so does Cyrus the Great. And it's alleged that the initial empires was a lot smaller compared to the Greater Persian Empire, the Median Empire as it was known then. So basically, the smaller horn is the southern Elam,
The Persian
Persian
part of the
Empire,
empire.
and the Median is the longer horn. And also we can take it allegorically, meaning that the Greater Persian Empire, and also subsequently when Persians conquered Lydia, modern-day Turkey, that was a smaller horn.
Because when we deal with the Holy Quran and the verses, we will see how it relates to this ram and the two horns. So, Arif, also there are other verses in the Bible as well which relate specifically to Cyrus. Do you want to...
Yes, I mean, these refer to his righteousness, and particularly the book of Isaiah and the book of Ezra. I'll read a portion from either one. So this is from Isaiah 45:13, and it is said here that God is described as saying, I will raise up Cyrus in my righteousness. I will make all his ways straight. He will rebuild my city and set my exiles free, but not for a price or reward, says God Almighty. So as this text suggests, ultimately Cyrus did release the Jews, the nation of Israel, from exile, and he didn't ask for any compensation or any tribute or any ransom. I think we talked about
In
this.
fact, he contributed, didn't he, to the
Absolutely helped
rebuilding and helped the building of the temple as well.
Well, this is also then goes on in Ezra, the book of Ezra, chapter 6, verse 3. And I'll just read the first part of that. And this says as follows. In the first year of King Cyrus, Cyrus the king issued a decree concerning the house of God at Jerusalem. Let the temple, the place where sacrifices are offered, be rebuilt, and let its foundations be retained. So it was showing that he was very sympathetic towards the Jews. He was very caring of them, and he in effect released them from bondage. And even today in Israel, we see there's a lot of reverence and respect for Cyrus. I think I was just actually looking, there's actually in Jerusalem, there's a street called the Cyrus Street. So it shows how much high esteem that they hold him and revere him.
So it's interesting, when the Holy Prophet ﷺ was conveying the message of Islam early on in Mecca, obviously, he was up against the Quraysh and idolatry and everything. But very soon, as he had to move to Medina, where there were lots of Christians and Jews, etc. And the Holy Quran was always a step ahead in terms of dealing with the subject matter and the sort of things that the Holy Prophet ﷺ and the Muslims were going to encounter. And this is where the issue of Zulqarnain comes up. And perhaps you could read, this is Surah Al-Kahf, chapter 18 and verse 84. Amjad, do you want to start and then we will
absolutely. So when Prophet migrated to Medina in the town of Yathrib, as it was known then, there were significant Jewish tribes there, and they were bound to ask concerning such matters. So they thought the Prophet was ummi and illiterate and not very well versed, so they wanted to test his knowledge. So, like you quite rightly said, Allah is one step ahead of these people. And Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, this is Surah Al-Kahf, chapter 18, verse 84. And they asked thee concerning Dhul-Qarnayn, say, I will recite to you something of his account. We have established him in the earth and gave him the means to achieve everything. Then he followed a certain way, until when he reached the setting place of the sun, he found it setting as if in a pool of murky water, and near it he found a people. We said, O Dhul-Qarnayn, you may punish them or treat them with kindness. He said, as for him who does wrong, we shall certainly punish him, and then shall we brought back to his Lord, who will punish him with dreadful punishment. But as for him who believes and acts righteously, he will have a good reward with his Lord, and we too shall speak to him easy words of our command.
So in relation to this verse, and we will go on with the following verses, these verses clearly show the humility of this conqueror, and we're going to discuss what the interpreters, commentators of the Holy Quran saw as the Zulqarnain. Shows the humility of this conqueror and his belief in God and justice, etc. Now, interestingly, early on, a lot of commentators and interpreters of the Holy Quran seem to refer to this as Alexander the Great, because clearly he was a great empire builder, massive. But I think they were mistaken in that one.
I think maybe where they mistook this, because obviously this talks about military conquest, and I think obviously they thought, well, Alexander the Great, as his name suggests, was a great military leader, and that this somehow was referring to him. But there are lots of reasons when you reflect on these verses, and we'll obviously be going through it in a bit more detail, why this could not possibly refer to Alexander. So, for example, we know that Alexander's conquest happened in a very short period of time, and they were basically almost like a whirlwind, where he was conquering, and whereas the expeditions that Cyrus undertook, they were a lot more measured and they took a lot more time. There was a lot more planning. So this is just one aspect of it, that why this could not possibly have been
I think
Alexander.
there's also a specific point, and we'll go into these later, because the Holy Quran points out a number of distinctive features for Zulkarnain. But probably the most important one was being that he was a monotheist, this conqueror. And Alexander the Great certainly wasn't. He almost raised himself to be a deity, a god.
As we mentioned in the first part, it's quite well established that Cyrus was practicing the Zoroastrian faith, and they do believe
very
in life
much a
after
monotheistic
death, religion, which Alexander absolutely was not.
Actually, Alexander, he believed in the pantheon of Greek gods, as it were. Is historically well known. There's a biography of him written by his own general and his lover. So basically, he was practicing sexual as well. It's well documented, and that's not a slur on him, because his own biographer says
so. They were questionable characters.
They were questionable characters, and above all, he was not merciful and righteously guided, because the criteria set in the Quran, it says he's a righteous servant of the Lord, Dhul-Qarnayn. So that's the test. And Alexander, unfortunately, cannot ever meet that, because he was not righteous by any sense of the word. He was a polytheist. He was a homosexual, and he actually raised some significant portion of the Asian cities. He just his armies
destroyed them,
and even the great Persian capital Persepolis is well documented. When they conquered it, they ensued basically a week of orgies and merrymaking, and they said after that they set the whole place alight. And in many of the cities they burnt. For instance, the people of Tyre, they did not surrender. Just the city of Tyre in modern day Lebanon, and they razed it to the ground and they burnt it.
Also, in relation to the verse 87 here, it says, until when he reached the setting place of the sun, he found it setting as if in a pool of murky water, and near it he found a people. This clearly refers to the first conquests of Cyrus the Great, where he went westward after incorporating the Median Empire, then the Lydian, and going up to the Aegean and towards Thrace, Greece, etc. And the Aegean Sea, and on the borders of the Black Sea as well, is where you have oceans, and when the sun sets, it's going into the sea. So in a sense, it's referring to that westernmost.
It's a description
expansion
of in a geographical terms of where the place was.
It signifies so my colleague Arif is quite wrong. It signifies the westernmost part of the Cyrus Empire, or the northwestern boundary of the Asia Minor, what we refer to in our geography today as the Black Sea, or could be the Aegean Sea, because it formed the northern western boundary.
Because that's as the sun
empire.
was setting, basically, it was heading towards the sea. And equally, if we read the verses after that, then, because this is interesting, because it refers to the directions that Zulkarnain, and from that we can deduce it clearly had to be Cyrus the Great. So we finished on verse 88, didn't we? And then it says in 90, then indeed he followed another way. And then 91, Arif, do you want to read that?
Yes, from verse 91 onwards, it says as follows. Until when he reached the rising place of the sun, he found it rising on a people for whom he made no shelter against it. I think just in this particular bit, this refers to the expedition to the east, probably to Afghanistan today, modern day Balochistan,
as well.
And where there was very barren and there was no trees, and where the sun beat down very fiercely. And it could also refer to the people who lived in the plains for hundreds of miles, which are the east of Herat and Sistan, and up to the north to Duzdab and up to Mashhad as well. So again, the description matches the areas where Cyrus was traveling, or where Cyrus
So this
was
is his
conquering.
western expansion and eastern expansion. Western with the the sun going down, and the eastern parts with the sun coming up and with people feeling the heat. And then we carry on. Amjad, do you want to read this bit? Verse 90, then he followed another way, and this is the third part of his conquest.
Until when he reached the open place between the two mountains, he found beneath them a people who could scarcely understand the word of what he said. They said, O Dhul-Qarnain, verily Gog and Magog are creating disorder on the earth. Shall we then pay thy tribute in condition that thou set up a barrier between us and them? So basically, he followed another path, and here
this is the northern towards the Caspian Sea.
Mountain towards the Caspian Sea, perhaps towards the Zagros Mountains, and maybe towards the Caucasus. I think
absolutely,
the Caucasus are mountainous of the steppe, this is a region which have all went by the name of Saktia, including Russia and today the Russia and the surrounding territory, or the Caucasus, from which in the past, during that era, around 300 BC, many hordes of barbarians, they will set upon these villages and cause a lot of mischief.
I mean, these were the nomadic tribes, basically, that caused havoc across the rest of the world, and Asia was continuously attacked by them. Whereas other attackers settled down and they were relatively more civilized, these tribes used to come, attack, destroy, and just move on. And the term also, first time it's used here, I suppose, Yajuj or Majuj or Gog or Magog as used in the Bible. So it's interesting because in a sense this verse also relates to the latter days, but we won't go into that at the moment. But at that stage, so these tribes were attacking, and Dhul-Qarnain was really felt obliged to help those people and support them. We'll go into a little bit more of this verse and carry on. Arif, do you want to...
Yes, so verse 96 onwards. He replied, the power with which my Lord has endowed me about this is better than the resources of my enemies, but you may help me with strength of labourers. I will set up a rampart between you and them. So again, this relates to a historical incident where basically he was asking the inhabitants, Cyrus was asking the inhabitants of that place to provide him with human labour.
In the next verse, it talks about what was required in relation to iron. Do you want to read that as well?
Yes, so in verse 97, it says, bring me blocks of iron. They did so till when he had filled up the space between the two mountainsides. He said, now blow with your bellows. They blew till when he had made it red as fire. He said, bring me molten copper that I may pour it thereon. So just from this you can tell this was basically regarding a building of a wall between these two parts. And I think this was between the Caspian Sea and the Caucasus Range.
Yeah.
And this was a thick wall that was too thick to be broken and very, very high, maybe as high as 30 feet and 10 feet thick. And it defended the Persian frontier. But this, the thing about the copper, iron and molten copper, is that it doesn't rust, so it doesn't corrode. And obviously there was a great amount of engineering and technical skill which was required to be able to build this so that it could actually last for a long time.
I mean, in many ways it shows really the thinking of this emperor. Here he was faced with these marauding tribes that created havoc, and he could have easily withdrawn, but he wanted to support the people as well. And by building this sophisticated wall, which clearly, I understand it was all, some say that it was up to 10 feet thick,
30 feet
this
high.
mixture of iron and copper. It was an incredible feat, don't you think?
Absolutely, as the Holy Quran alludes to in the verse 98, it says, so they, the Gog and Magog, were not able to scale it, nor were they able to dig underneath it or through it. And thereupon he said, this is mercy from my Lord, but when the promise of my Lord shall come to pass, he will break it into pieces. And the promise of my Lord is certainly true. Again, Dr. Saab, you alluded to the fact that it speaks volumes about the technical skills of this general statesman and also of his army. And he's been known as to the great builder as well. The great roads of the ancient times were built by him long before Alexander came onto the scene. He was not even born then. We're looking at Alexander utilizing the same highways, the Persian highways actually. And I think in the previous program we alluded to the fact that at every few miles on these great highways that linked all the great ancient cities and towns and these kingdoms, there was, water wells, fresh horses. So basically mail can, we think, we've got the internet today and the international postal system. We initiated the postal system. So, of course, his soldiers can send messages to the central capital, but not just that, ordinary civilians can likewise as well. And international trade flourished and much interaction and so forth happened. And brought cultures together, civilizations together, and there was a lot of tolerance. So, people can go from one place. It was all one empire, which was multinational, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, and all religions were tolerated.
And I think there's also one other very interesting aspect about this, because obviously in verse 99 he mentioned, "This is a mercy from my Lord, but when the promise of my Lord shall come to pass, he will break it into pieces." So it may even suggest that he was given some sort of insight or revelation
of what will happen
in the future, that obviously when Gog and Magog become strong and develop, that they will probably end up breaking this to bits or pieces. But, it shows that was appropriate for the time, and that served a very useful purpose for that.
I'm going to come to that bit because I think it'd be useful for our listeners to understand. But the interesting thing is, those who talked about perhaps Alexander the Great being Zulkarnain and also setting up this are in a sense proved wrong, because my understanding is that this wall was now so firm that neither the Persians could go up into the sort of the areas by the Scythians or Caucasus, etc., nor could they come down, and that provided in many respects a safety net for the empire, and
stability,
it lasted for several centuries in security. And the other bit is that the grandson of Cyrus, Darius I, had to attack some of these northern tribes, and the records show that he had to go through Europe and then go and attack them. Clearly, if the gate wasn't there built by Cyrus, then he would have gone straight up through those passes and gone and attacked them. So again, it confirms that the Holy Quran in many ways actually confirms the identity of Zulkarnain as Cyrus the Great without any doubt. The other bit I just wanted to talk about is here the Holy Quran is not just describing the feat of this great conqueror, but it's almost giving a prophecy about the future as well, isn't it? Because the term Gog and Magog are used to the races and the peoples who are really ferocious fighters from the north in many respects, and the Bible refers to them and they trace them back to the sons of
Gog and Magog. Actually, these are the very people who sucked Rome. If you ever look, basically
they caused havoc for Rome, didn't they?
The people of the steppe. So you've got the Han, Attila the Hun came afterwards, and they sucked Rome, so we have the Visigoths, some of these Germanic tribes. These are all find their origin on the Caucasus steppe, and hence the name
So
Caucasian.
poor Europe really had to, they had nowhere else to go.
So modern day Chechnya, Ingushetia is the original abode of the Alans, the Visigoths, the Huns, and they are of, obviously a vicious brutality. And so is the abode of the famous Amazon queens that, came from the steppe. These were Amazonian queens, the legends of... we have this legend of Xena, don't we?
Xena.
She's an Amazonian queen and a warrior queen, and from the people from the steppe. So hence we have these Caucasian, and there is a legend also in Cornish court in Britain. There's a legend of Cornwall. So we have the modern Cornwall, the Cornwall coast here, and it's been known as since the ancient times a mining town for tin. Copper and tin, actually, mainly tin. And tin was obviously highly prized because it had anti-rust properties. And so there is a legend of the dragoons, the foot soldiers that are still, we have in the British Army, the foot soldiers are sometimes referred to, the elite fighting troops are known as the dragoon or the dragon warriors. And these were the emblem of the Gog and Magog, was also the emblem of the dragon. of the steppe people.
That's interesting. So here,
It's mythology, well, mythology.
yeah,
we do not know, but it's,
absolutely. But I think it's interesting for people to know, because there is a lot going on in modern theology and modern politics. And no doubt you'll remember when President Bush was preparing to attack Iraq. He rang Chirac and started talking about Gog and Magog. So these are not totally far-fetched mythologies. These relate to even our current world and what it means. And certainly in this Zulkarnain series of verses, there is a prophecy about the latter days when Gog and Magog, the northern-based Christian nations, because ultimately those nations came to accept Christianity, and they will run amok as well and create wars throughout the world. And one of those wars, as the ending verses in this chapter talks about when the trumpet is blown out.
If we just read these verses at 100 and 101, I think these summarize the situation very well. So verse 100 says, "And on that day we shall leave some of them to surge against others, and the trumpet will be blown. Then we shall gather them all together. And on that day we shall present hell face to face to the disbelievers." So you can see here, this is referring to great military battles, world wars, and obviously the destruction and the fighting and the hatred.
And in many respects, that iron and copper gate may have been there on a small scale relatively. Now with aircraft carriers and aircraft and ships and whatever, the release of the people from the northern end who use fire for really their dominance, it paints quite a frightening scenario, but only God knows what lies in the future for us, but that's interesting. Well, I think it's been a fascinating discussion about Cyrus the Great. When we look at how the world was at his time, it's incredible, really, what he achieved. From the early empires, from Sumeria, Arcadia, Assyria, even Egypt, etc. Oh, by the way, talking about Egypt, it was his son, wasn't it, who conquered Egypt as well, and really gave to the maximum size of the Persian Empire that we quite often talk about. But clearly Cyrus had set the scene for some great achievements. He was a great, noble leader. Not only did he want to conquer people, but he wanted to win their hearts and minds, and for many he was seen as a liberator. And certainly for the Persian nation, he was seen as a father figure. And even to this day, I think many Iranians, as you mentioned, the Nobel Prize winner lady, I've forgotten her name, she was referring to Cyrus the Great as a great inspiration for somebody who came from Iran as well. And I think many great people have arisen from the Iranian people, including for us as Ahmadis, the roots of the promised Messiah, Mahdi alayhi salam, as well, for us are from the Persian linkage as well. So there's something particularly special about that land. Amjad, you wanted to comment?
Well, basically, the British historian Charles Freeman suggests that in scope and extent, and I quote, in scope and extent of his achievements, that Cyrus ranks far above that of Macedonian king Alexander the Great, who had to demolish the Achaemenian Empire, but failed to provide any stable alternative. Cyrus has been a personal hero to many of the rulers of the world, particularly the founding fathers of the United States, including Thomas Jefferson, and the last Iranian King Mohammed Reza Shah Pahlavi, and even to the Israeli Prime Minister David Ben Gurion. What an irony, but it just shows the greatness of a man, that he was humane. He was, he had enormous potential and capabilities as a wise ruler and a just king.
Well, as I said at the start, there's not many rulers and kings who can claim to have the love and affection of their subjects, the Persians, the respect of their enemies, i.e. as in the Greeks, and the reverence of religious communities from the Jews and Muslims and many other people as well. So I think it's been a fascinating program. I want to thank Arif and Amjad. If our listeners could give feedback on our program through our Twitter handle at VI Living History, we would be grateful. We would love to hear some ideas as well from people. So until our next program, Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much.